It's a great pleasure for me, actually, to introduce our next speaker, Elizabeth or Libby Otto, who is an associate professor at the University of Buffalo and is currently a senior fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, CASBA. Among her numerous recent publications on the Bauhaus, which focus particularly on Bauhaus women, we had a question about the Bauhaus Me Too movement last night. So this is it, babies. The one that has, I would say, the strongest new car smell right now is this really excitingly titled book, Haunted Bauhaus, which is also up there, and which also has handy dandy postcards, so you can take one and eventually buy one. Not a postcard, but a book. And the full title is Haunted Bauhaus, Occult Spirituality, Gender Fluidity, Queer Identities, and this is hot off the presses from MIT. So I'm going to keep all these introductions short because I think we want to hear from the people and not so much from me and about them, but I'm excited about this talk. So hopefully
Hey. Freya and Paul, thank you for this invitation. Thanks to everyone for coming. I'm excited about ongoing Bauhaus discussion. It's been a Bauhaus festival in my mind for a couple of years, so it's fun to have it in the world too. Let me just hang on, you go away. This is what happens when the Mac user gets in front of a PC. All right. So this book talks about, in chapters, I go into the experimental religions of the Bauhaus, gender construction, both masculinity and femininity. I'm talking about femininity today. Then also a queer Bauhaus, which is kind of the most speculative and archival chapter, and then the issue of politics. I just had a half hour, so I'm focusing on one part of it, but I wanted you to know the context that this work is coming out of. The enormous range of vibrant artistic contributions made by the over 450 female Bauhaus members through the 14-year existence of the school. So the school itself had 1,253 members, but 450 women, remember that, is plain to see in the archives. However, until recently, mainstream accounts of the school have most often failed to acknowledge the significance of Bauhaus women's work, either on its own or in relation to its impact on the institution. This is even so where logic might dictate otherwise, as in the case of the record set for the highest price ever paid at auction for a Bauhaus object for this MT49 tea extract pot, which sold for $361,000 in 2007. And I just was sent within the last year the Thames and Hudson kind of survey of modern art, 2 pages on every modern art movement, and there's not one woman from the Bauhaus. There are 6 people, including Joost Schmidt, whose work I won't be showing today. I think many of you haven't heard of him, but he was there. It is maybe a Me Too movement. And one of the goals of this book was to, include women in every single chapter and really integrate their point of view, because I'm done with the 5 dudes Bauhaus history. So curator Klaus Weber called this the Bauhaus in a nutshell for its perfect encapsulation of the principles of modern design. And yet Brandt's name is still often omitted from the school. The fact that women have been relegated to the margins of Bauhaus history is consistent with aspects of the institution over time, and this came up a bit last night, despite its auspicious and inclusive beginnings. In 1919, in that manifesto that Freya showed earlier, Gropius called for I find this so cute because it's like your grandpa trying not to be sexist. He said there would be no distinction between the fair and strong sex. I think he meant well. Accordingly, during the first semester, the balance actually exceeded parity, with women outnumbering men 84 to 79. And this configuration actually never took place again. And that was simply because Gropius, concerned of charges of dilettantism, right? This is, I think, important for us to remember. We take the Bauhaus for granted as a big name, but he was an institution builder, and he was quite concerned that in a sexist world, too many women would wreck the school's reputation. So secretly, meeting with the other masters, they determined to, quote, improve the quality of the students by making it harder for women to get in. And over the course of the institution, their numbers were reduced to a third of the total student body. And yet, women make up over 37% of the total number of people who studied and worked at the Bauhaus. So in Haunted Bauhaus, I draw on, and these pictures I wanted to show you because, the image on the left, I think, kind of illustrates this story of women shunted to the side, right? There's Günther Stutzel, the one woman, but she's very much almost seems like a token there. And in fact, right at this moment, she has a very difficult battle to get the same title as the other junior masters, former students who become teachers behind her, and she's still being paid less. So in Haunted Bauhaus, I draw on Avery Gordon's book, Ghostly Matters, writing against postmodernism's tendency to simplify, reduce, and totalize. Gordon's notion of haunting is a way of engaging those who are meant to be invisible, yet show up without any sign of leaving, as she writes. More broadly, this haunting describes a paradigmatic way in which life, particularly modern life, quote, is more complicated than those of us who study it have usually granted, since visibility is a complex system of permission and prohibition, presence and absence. And in fact, the Bauhaus actually was more complicated than the now iconic official photograph on the roof that you see on your left implies. One just has to look at different pictures and objects to see that. So if we look at the picture on the right, which was taken 3.5 years later in the same spot, we actually see the women's gymnastics course, which is probably a regular event up in this space. The Bauhaus photographer Telux Feininger was on hand to take pictures of the students, female students, as they leapt and tumbled under the guidance of modern dancer Carla Grosch, who's on the right, who was on staff as the women's gymnastics instructor. And in fact, recent research has uncovered, this is a table that's in Bauhaus Women, Bauhaus Bodies. I'll show you these books in just a minute, but it's put together by my collaborator Patrick Rössler and Anke Blum. And it shows us something very important, which is earlier feminist art histories have done great work with looking at how women were really pushed into the weaving workshop. But what's happened is the story often becomes all women were pushed into the weaving workshop. And in fact, it was just over a quarter of them. Women were in every single program and workshop in the Bauhaus. And that's important to remember. On average, they stayed a little bit less time than the men, but they were there and they were doing interesting stuff that is worthy of our attention. So just briefly, to write Haunted Bauhaus is the product of almost 2 decades worth of research, but I was also drawing on collaborative projects. Bauhaus Bodies, which includes an essay by Morgan Riddler, who's here. 14 scholars contributed to this, and I co-edited it. Bauhaus Women, A Global Perspective, which is Patrick Rössler and my take on 45 Bauhaus women that we think everybody should know, and especially with an eye to their global impact. And then Vier Bauhausmädels was an exhibition held in Erfurt. It also traveled to Berlin, and it's a substantive exhibition catalog that looks at the work of Gertrude Arndt, Marianne Brandt, Margarete Hemann-Löwenstein, and Greta Reichert. So they represent ceramics, photography, metalwork, and weaving, among other things, because most Bauhaus people did a lot of different stuff. Okay, so in the rest of my paper, I'm going to focus on 4 key Bauhaus designers, 2 of whom Tai also has talked about a bit, Marianne Brandt and Gertrude Arndt. They'll come at the end. in order to look at how Bauhaus women were not only present, but how when we reintegrate them into histories of the Bauhaus, we actually come up with a different and, I would argue, much richer history of the school. I'm interested in particular in how we can think of them in terms of their information or their interest rather in transformability, kind of modular design, and how that responds both to constructions of new womanhood at this time and then these kind of dramatic historical situations that they couldn't have anticipated, but their design skills hold up to. A dress is not there for its own sake, but to be worn. This was the pronouncement of Paris-based fashion journalist Renata Richter-Green, who, as I note, was later known as Ré-Suppos, writing in the Werkbund journal Die Form in 1930. She wrote, "Today, 90% of all women work, and these 90% need rational clothing. Life is in perpetual motion. Preferences for line, color, and attitude change, and these pensions also differ for each person. It must be a matter of fulfilling the specific demands of a dress's utility. This is the central problem of today's fashion for the 90% of women." Richter-Green's solution to these demands was the transformation dress, a simple, beautifully cut, sleeveless sheath that could be combined with a minimal number of elements to fit any occasion the modern woman might encounter. For work, wear it alone, as you see in the top left, or add a belt and a sweater. These things all came with it. Change up the look, switch those out with a jacket and a tie. That was actually called a women's tie at the top right, a Damenkrawatte. We need to bring it back, I think. Gloves and a matching clutch. And no need to get a new gown for going out in the evening when you can simply slip a long skirt over the sheath and add a cape and jewelry. In total, this one dress could be transformed into 10 different outfits. Looking back, Ré-Suppos remembered, "I always started with a concrete idea, a secretary or a saleswoman, etc., who wants to go out in the evening after work, but can't go home beforehand, transforms her dress." She added that the main requirements were first-class fabric that would stand up to all the stresses and the cut. Renata Richter-Green, the Bauhäusler, better known by the name of Ré-Suppos, was a designer, journalist, filmmaker, and photographer. And I'll just note in passing, she came to the Bauhaus named Erna Niemeyer, and this is classic when you're researching women, that you have to know their different names because they change them. You have to look in different places in the archive notes and the indexes. So I think there's also circumstances that have contributed to their obscurity. With her transformation dress, Suppos reimagined female-coded clothing to match the unfolding life of new women like herself, whose dynamic modern lives called for the need to adapt quickly and travel light. Affordability was key to her transformational designs, which she also created in a hybrid form of clothing of which she was one of the originators, culottes. I love that. This allowed for greater movement and even could allow the wearer to go directly from work to a weekend getaway without any luggage. As with her fashion designs, Suppos' life and work were seemingly in constant transformation. After 2 years in the Bauhaus, from 21 to 23, she moved to Berlin and remained on the books in the Bauhaus and participated in the 1923 Staatliches Bauhaus exhibition. Freya showed us the exhibition catalog cover earlier. In Berlin, she joined up with circles of fellow Bauhäusler and collaborated on films with now two of the most famous avant-garde filmmakers of the time. Above all, Viking Egeling, I just show you images from his Diagonal Symphony on the left, and helped him finish that film before his death. So he really taught her that craft. She also shot portions of Hans Richter's film study, and she also then married him in 1926, and through him came to know other avant-gardists, including Fernand Léger, Man Ray, and Sergei Eisenstein. With her second husband in the 30s, the French surrealist poet and journalist Philippe Suppos, whom she met in 1933, she traveled the world and photographed societies in the grip of ferocious change. She captured Parisian street life, architecture in rural villages of Norway, and Spain on the brink of a civil war. They lived in North Africa in exile from Vichy, France, and during that time, among the many photographs she took, were in the reserved quarter, or the quartier réservé, for which she had to get special permission and a police escort. And I don't know of any other woman who actually received this permission. She took a series of images that are remarkable, I think, for both their empathy and their intimacy. When Philippe and Rey-Suppot fled advancing Italian and German fascist forces in 1942, they hitched a ride on one of the last buses out of Tunis for the Algerian border, and she had to travel light. The Suppots simply boarded the bus with nothing at all. This meant abandoning her archive of thousands of negatives and all of her photographic equipment, because if she'd been caught with a camera, she probably would have been shot on spot. The loss of the latter, the camera, might have been painful, but it was then essential. They were effectively stateless for the next years and had no money. But they were traveling through the Americas as Philippe worked to create a network for a news agency for the French Comité of National Liberation, which was the provisional government under Charles de Gaulle. During this time, Rey used found technology to make a daring self-portrait. This was taken at an amusement park in Buenos Aires in 1944, and her expatriate friends, photographer Giselle Freund and screenwriter Jacques Remy, appear in the background. In the foreground, glamorous Rey-Suppot is singularly focused. She appears locked almost with her gaze on us, but if we decipher the image, we see she's armed and dangerous. Her face is partially obscured by a gun that is trained, it seems, on the viewer. In a way, this photograph evokes the violence and uncanny nature of the wartime context in which it was made, and it encapsulates the improvisational spirit fostered by Suppot's contingent situation. Cameraless though she was, she actually took this photograph herself, because this was at this state fair. If you shot the air gun and got a bullseye, it took your picture. So this was the prize photograph. This is not then an image of a woman driven to violence, but it shows her mastering yet another mechanized technology so that she could take a picture at a time when she had nothing. So for that moment, she becomes a photographer again. Rey-Suppot's work epitomizes the drive to explore new ways of living and being that was the spirit of Bauhaus New Womanhood. She's a Bauhaus artist and member of the international avant-garde who's been omitted from these movements' histories, but nevertheless haunts their margins. Her transformative art also reflects on the dramatic historical events through which she lived, and in which she created a range of, she lived through a range, rather, of monumentally shifting circumstances that forced her to react and adapt. Okay, the second of the four artists I want to talk about is Friedel Dicker, who I think leads us really in very different directions for the Bauhaus. In addition to designing modern objects, obviously very important for this conference, a number of Bauhaus women became architects, literally transforming the built landscapes around them. Friedel Dicker was a member of the early group of Bauhaus students who came to the school in 1919 with Johannes Itten. She was seemingly able to design anything. She worked on weaving, bookbinding, painting and drawing, photography, stage set and costume design, and interior and architectural design. And her street puppetry was a favorite with local children. She was really cool. She's also the first student who the masters asked to teach another student, a mark of respect, but it was also because she needed a scholarship. She was from a poor family in Vienna. After she left the school, Dicker was a part of the Bauhaus design duo that created visionary architecture and interior design together with Franz Singer, her fellow student. Among their achievements are their collaboration on a flat roof building with 4 apartments from 1922 to 23. It wasn't built, but it's the earliest documented architecture design in which a female Bauhaus student is known to have participated with a flat roof, I should specify. Multifunctionality was a hallmark of their collaboration. They were interested in convertible furniture and multi-use spaces and even toys. And this Fantasis toy set from 1925 kind of illustrates that. It's a colorful collection of shapes that could be used to create animals: rabbit, giraffe, seal, and cat. You can see here on the left is turtle, and on the right is pelican. But it's just a lot like Lego, which is actually a post-war creation. So there were instructions for children who really dig that, and then you could also just go rogue if you wanted to, as many children did. More elaborate than Alma Seedhoff Buscher's 1923 Bauhaus toy set, so there are other Bauhaus toy sets. Fantasius is a precursor then to Lego, for example. Dicker and Singer were working in Vienna, and their aesthetic was actually fairly unique for that context. And this attracted international clients that gave them the scope to take on projects further afield in Berlin, Prague, Zilna, and Budapest. Their clients tended to be members of the intellectual bourgeoisie who embraced the design duo's overt modernity. A particular specialty of the firm was its convertible furniture and interior design, especially often thought of for small, modernist urban spaces. So this is an image from a guest house that they designed in Vienna for the Countess Herriot that was outfitted with two main guest rooms, and they each had, as you can see at the top, a kind of public space that could be, guests could relax or even, receive other people. And then at night, the stairs retracted and a fully made up bed with bedside tables could roll out. This luxurious and futuristic space epitomizes Dicker and Singer's creative and flexible modern design. After 7 productive years, in early 1931, the duo closed their Viennese firm, but this was also largely because Dicker had been radicalized. She'd been working in the Montessori movement, which in Vienna was closely connected to the communist movement. Also, Edith Tudor Hart has a very similar, they're at the Bauhaus at different times, but they have very similar trajectories in terms of their intellectual and political influences. With the global economic crisis that began with the New York stock crash in 1929, Vienna, like much of Europe, experienced a growing political polarization. And Dicker became an activist and member of the Communist Party. She again transformed herself as an artist and began making highly political photomontages, works that drew on the visual vocabularies of John Hartfield and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. This one, which is called Abundance of Goods, Sales, Crisis, decries the injustice of class division in a dynamic and monumental photomontage that centers on the powerful but helpless form of a laborer and his starving child. Around these tragic figures, photographic fragments draw parallels between the mass production of food and that of weapons. In stenciled letters, Dicker decries the actions of her Austrian contemporaries. The bourgeoisie are becoming fascist, she observes. In 1934, she was arrested for her political work, interrogated, and imprisoned. And it was Singer who secured her freedom. She'd been arrested for creating forged documents, which I'm sure she did because she could do anything. And Singer was asked, did he think she'd done this? And he said, Friedel, she can't draw a straight line. She fled then to Prague. But before she left, she destroyed her photomontages. But she also knew how to photograph, so she took photos of them, and that's why they survive. From Prague, in Prague, she married a man named Brandeis, and they moved ever eastward. But as Jews, they lost their permits to work and eventually learned that they were going to be deported to Theresienstadt and threw themselves into actually preparing for this because Friedel Dicker was also an art educator, teaching largely Bauhaus methods to children, first already in Vienna, then in Prague, and even afterwards when she couldn't legally work anymore. In Theresienstadt ghetto and concentration camp, she taught over 500 children, in part using Bauhaus methods to connect hand and spirit, ideas that she'd learned from her teacher Johannes Itten, but also Gertrude Grunau, another important Bauhaus teacher. In Theresienstadt, her aim was not to help children connect to their historical moment. Rather, she sought to enable them to escape for it for a while. She was ultimately murdered in Auschwitz, but two of her students came to the U.S. Anna Furman, who studied with her in Theresienstadt, became a child psychologist and did use some drawing in her practice. And Edith Kramer came to New York and was one of the founders of the art therapy movement. So this is what I mean by, Bauhaus goes very different and really influential and important places when we integrate women back in. Okay, I want to return to Marianne Brandt, to the originator of this teapot that I mentioned before. She made this during her first semester in the metal workshop, which was one of the most male-dominated workshops within the Bauhaus. But she made her way there. She later claimed she didn't really get it, that they were trying to get her to leave by giving her all the crap work all the time. And she rose actually to become the Mitarbeiter, or assistant of the workshop master, who was Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. And eventually, when Moholy-Nagy left in 1928, she became acting director. And it was she who was responsible for garnering most of the firms for production of Bauhaus lighting, which was an important source of income, as Tai mentioned, for the Bauhaus, kind of keeping it afloat. So she had to actually go out and, wear business clothes and bring a suitcase and get these contracts. This is in the Bauhaus, the Dessau Bauhaus, in the weaving workshop, where lights designed by her or in collaboration with other Bauhaus members are hung throughout the building. And I just mentioned briefly, you can see how adjustable they are, that they this supports my argument about transformative design, but it's also because of this changing moment at the Bauhaus, where they're both teaching the craft of weaving, but they're also designing for industry, and these lamps sort of respond to both kinds of work. Brandt learned photography prior to coming to the Bauhaus, but as a student of Moholy-Nagy, she took a new modernist approach to the medium. At least 100 photographs can be securely attributed to her Bauhaus period. In the winter of 1928 to 29, while she was acting director of the metal workshop, and thus one of the highest-ranking women at the school, she created a significant series of photographic self-portraits, including 6 that she took in her studio in the Dessau Bauhaus's Preller House wing. Each of these photographs shows her reflected in a metallic coated glass ball, so think of something like a Christmas tree ornament, so that her face and body are imaged through metal, the material of her revolutionary designs. This use of a reflective ball in modernist and Bauhaus portraiture was well established by the time she did this, but in her hands, the photographs function as a reflection on her medium and almost as a kind of snow globe to reflect, capture, and encapsulate a distorted version of the Bauhaus world. So I'm interested in these photographs particularly as a series of representations of herself as a kind of artist constructor or artist engineer, something that a number of artists in the avant-garde, but especially at the Bauhaus, and I show you her mentor and friend Laszlo Moholy-Nagy here, were coming to grips with at this time. As leader of the metal workshop, Brandt was in a period of transition, transforming herself from the artist and designer she'd been to a leader and even businesswoman negotiating contracts on behalf of the Bauhaus. It wasn't an easy job, and even some of her close colleagues and friends in the workshop, such as Hidden Bredendijk, were actually challenging her authority in this role. So in this portrait here, she holds the camera, and it's a Rolleiflex, so she actually would have, you can only look at it if it's down here, so she can't see what she's doing. And she's kind of showing herself as technologically competent, but also bright-eyed and childlike, a kind of androgynous imp who peers in from the side of the picture. She bends the Bauhaus around her through the construction, right? All these straight lines become curvy, and it's snowing outside. And it centers on a play of kind of representation and abstraction, reflected elements of a snowy landscape and the Gropius design building, and then a kind of confusion in terms of what's real and what's twisted in the image. In these photographs, such as this one, she creates a swirl of Bauhaus textures with her head appearing as one of a series of spheres. She's playful and cute as before, but this photograph, I think, suggests a struggle for Blanche. She's creating herself as an artist constructor, but she seems always often at least, to hide her body or diminish it, as if her female body doesn't, for her, quite fit into this role, except in one of these images. So one example takes on this issue of the represented female body quite directly. Here she appears in the lower part of the sphere, dressed in white, so she stands out against the dark background. And this is in the space of her studio in the Dessau Bauhaus still. She meets the viewer's gaze. That just, here's a detail from that photograph on the left. Look at this in particular. With a sort of come hither look, a pose that recalls the long tradition of the reclining female nude, say a Venus, etc. Her hair, though, is sleeked back in a kind of new woman look. Her face is made up, and she appears in a high fashion dress with stockings and high-heeled shoes, which wasn't her normal garb. So the camera here is actually hidden. It's, if you look at the white wall, it's right in here. And in this one, by taking it out, it kind of plays in a way that she's no longer saying this is a representation about representation or I'm controlling this, but it kind of gives this moment in which we could just take her as a kind of Venus figure who's been photographed. And yet, I would say that she includes clues that she's ironizing this idea of the new woman being reduced to superficial fashion. What does, in this case, say the modern sexy Bauhaus new woman read in her leisure time? Why, it's the most recent issue of Bauhaus, the school's in-house journal. The magazine appears almost like product placement next to her. But importantly, this is the first issue of 1929, which includes her only published essay of the period, titled Bauhaus Style. It's an essay where she's pushing back to something published in the previous essay by the constructivist sculptor Noam Galbo, who had visited the school and claimed, above all, that in her workshop, they were creating a style. That was very bad. You should not create a style. Because they believed in truth to materials and efficiency and things being designed purely for their functionality. So Brandt wrote back, while we may, and she's talking particularly about the light designs here, while we may not have invented the electric light bulb, we have nevertheless endeavored to find a proper application of its essence and, for example, to liberate it from forms like the candelabra and the gas lamp, adapted without consideration for utility. Displaying a copy of Bauhaus, Brandt calls up her orientation towards necessity, utility, and truth to materials for design basics rather than any aesthetic criteria. And she embeds ideas of the constructor even as she shows a self-portrait of herself as a lady. I just want to remark briefly that exactly in 1929, somewhere else across the Atlantic, the British psychoanalyst Joan Riviere was articulating new theories about women's self-representation and their relationship to gendered power. I'm pretty certain that Marianne Brandt and Joan Riviere had no knowledge of one another. Rather, I want to point to a parallel that they're both looking at the same time. In her 1929 essay, Womanliness as a Masquerade, Riviere writes about professional women who she sees around her, who seem to, at times, display an overabundance of femininity to their male colleagues, which she hypothesized resulted from the fear of retribution for having sought and attained what she calls phallic power, because she's psychoanalytic. She writes, quote, "Womanliness, therefore, could be assumed and worn as a mask, both to hide the possession of masculinity and to avert the reprisals expected if she was found to possess it. The reader may now ask how I define womanliness, or where I draw the line between genuine womanliness and the masquerade. My suggestion is not, however, that there is any such difference. Whether radical or superficial, they are the same thing." Very different from her colleagues in psychoanalytic theory, and above all, I'd say Sigmund Freud exemplifies this. Riviere, in contrast, posits femininity as exclusively a construction, one that in retrospect we might call a performance, designed to placate the powerful men with whom women of her day were beginning to work side by side. Similarly, in these portraits, Blanche, too, seems to be trying out a series of ways of being. She uses photographs to engage with her own shifting identities, the recognition she was achieving in the Bauhaus for her skills as a designer, as well as her newfound power as a leader, even as her male colleagues were calling into question her suitability to hold that power. Okay. Just briefly, I want to talk about Gertrude Arndt, who you've already had your appetite whet for, because I think she's this important last example who does something very different yet again. Arndt, as Ty mentioned, was a weaver. She came to the Bauhaus already having trained in architecture in Erfurt and had already learned photography. She completed a survey of the city for the architecture practice. But like many, she was pressured to go into the weaving workshop, which she did. And she actually became kind of their crack rug designer. And this is her rug on the floor of the director's room where it was featured during the 1923 exhibitions. And she was incredibly skilled in that and was also really valued for her color. She'd done special training for that. In 1927, she sat for and passed her journeyman's exam for the guild system that weavers were in. And that day, she swore to herself that she would never weave again because she was tired of it. So she committed to this refusal of the profession, which she dedicated 4 years at the Bauhaus, and married Alfred Arndt, who had been her classmate. The pair moved away for him to pursue his architecture career, which he did the rest of his life. And, I think it's quite likely that he was so productive because he actually had some help at home. I think she was also working in the office, but that's not documented. When the two returned to the Bauhaus in 1929, Alfred Arndt was a master, and Gertrude Arndt decided not to reconnect to the weaving workshop where she would have been welcomed, but instead she lived in isolation from the school building, residing in a master's house. It was the house that Oskar Schlemmer had just vacated with his family. This could have been a luxury, but for Arndt, she felt she'd become a do-nothing or a Nichtstuerin. Out of what she later described as pure boredom, Arndt began to take photographs, works that she called mask photos. Despite the title, Arndt wears no masks. Instead, she transforms herself with makeup, veils, hats, and her own lively facial expressions. A quintessential example, and I'm glad you've seen a lot of examples of this already, but I want to focus on just a couple, is this mask photo number 39A, where she wears a look of surprise at the polka dots floating on the veil directly in front of her face, seemingly astonished at her own encapsulation in fabric. As a former weaver, fabric had been her medium. Here, it becomes useless ornament and an overwhelming environment from which she cannot, it seems, escape. One of the few people she showed this series to, she showed it to her husband Alfred, Otti Berger, and her friend Joost Schmidt. He looked at this one and said, "You look like a whore." There he is. This photograph, number 22, which we selected for the cover of Haunted Bauhaus because it's so awesome. And I always think she looks like Mae West, but Mae West wasn't on the screen yet. Number 22 has a clarity and simplicity that is refreshing after the layered barrages of fabric in a lot of the other portraits. Posed in a kind of contrapposto, Arndt turns to look at the camera over her shoulder with an almost smile that suggests connection to and even complicity with the viewer. Far from Brandt's reputation for rationality, here we might see a surrealist Bauhaus, a skilled designer and technician who refuses to perform and instead pictures herself as an uncanny beauty. So I just want to point out, during the same time, these two women in different parts on the Bauhaus campus are alone taking these self-portraits. And we know she took these actually by herself because she describes her process of setting up a broom handle and putting a little photo on it so she could focus. And then she rigged up, she didn't have a shutter release, so she rigged up like a string with a rock and all these things so that she could pull this without tipping over the camera. But, you know, they're two very different sets. So Brandt and she are working at the same time doing totally different things. As a body of work, Arndt's mask photos are experiments in the process of renouncing a Bauhaus identity to explore what it might be like to cease striving, to instead become utterly useless, pure ornament. The mask photos gesture towards nostalgia for a past, yet without any serious interest in it. They are numbered, but not in any particular order. So many of Arndt's male and female colleagues were engaged in discovering new identities for themselves as artists and designers, and figuring out how best to serve emerging markets, a path that Arndt herself had taken in her exceptionally fine work in the weaving workshop. In these photographs, Arndt embraced a creative unbecoming. What if, in an institution aimed at producing the right designs for the modern moment, she simply refused to strive, perform, or progress? As a member of a movement that prized quality, simplicity, and the eradication of all unnecessary ornamentation, what if she herself became nothing but surface and needless ornament? What if she let the trappings of multiple femininities overtake her? Jack Halberstam and other queer theorists ask us to question our culture's broader orientation to futurity, to know that failure is an option. Jack writes, "What kinds of rewards can failure offer us?" He continues, "Failure allows us to escape the punishing norms, the disciplined behavior, and manage human development with the goal of delivering us from unruly childhoods to orderly and predictable adulthoods. Failure preserves some of the wondrous anarchy of childhood and disturbs the supposedly clean boundaries between adults and children, winners and losers." In Arndt's case, these pictures allow her to transition from the forceful, emancipated Bauhäusler that she was, who came to the Bauhaus already a part of the radical Wandervogel movement. She wanted to study architecture, and she had the skills and the talent to do it. And here she's transitioned to a master's wife, and by the time she concluded the series in 1931, a mother. In contrast to Brandt, Arndt made her self-portraits in a context in which she did not need to fear masculine reprisals for her success. She had set her work as a designer aside for what appeared, at least on the surface, as a relatively conventional life. By making Bauhäusler who've been relegated to the margins, if they've appeared in the story at all, the center of the story, and by reintegrating these women into the Bauhaus's history, this enables us to understand the limits and failures of the institution's experiments. But more than that, one of the many payoffs of this richer understanding is a richer understanding of what the Bauhaus was, what it means, and why it matters. As an artistic and design node that drew high-powered young creative women and men from throughout Europe and beyond, the Bauhaus produced artists and designers whose work would adapt to fit their changing lives, to stand up to the challenges of their own times, or, as in the case of Gertrude Arndt, to acknowledge the Bauhaus's mission of building a better future and refuse it. Thank you. talk longer because I have more to say. Should I take a question?
I talk longer because I had more to say. That's a good. I want to use that one later on. Thank you, Libby, for such a really fascinating paper. And also, I just wanted to say, too, that it's really exciting to be teaching at the moment. My students are here, a lot of them. I'm teaching a history of German design right now, and we're really, really fortunate to be able to read some of this new work, including Libby's work and Ty's work. And this is like a really great moment to be teaching this material, because when I was learning it, 15 years ago, it was fun, but there wasn't a lot of really exciting scholarship to read. So it's kind of a lovely thing to have now. We probably have no minutes for questions, but I think we should have them anyway. Would anyone like to ask questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Did Gertrude Arndt survive the Second War, and where did she spend her last decade?
She lived to be, I've only ever seen her in photos, but she was like such a fabulous looking tiny old woman. I think she lived at least into the 80s, if not the 90s. They lived in Popcella, which is a smaller town in the state of Thuringia. Alfred, so she stayed at home. They created some trouble with the neighbors because she cooked on the stove with Jena glassware, probably by Wagenfeld, and they thought this is terrible, like cooking with glass on the stovetop. So she raised 3 children, and Alfred continued working and worked through the Nazi period. I don't know that he did anything particularly ideological, but he did join the party at one point. He later said, and I mean, it's true that this was to help get contracts, but it's a problematic history. I think, part of what I'm interested in too is always to kind of have an alarm bell in my head when I'm trying to make a hero out of an artist, even as I want to engage their work.
I'm wondering about I think you created this really interesting parallel between Brandt and Arndt, and I'm wondering what the exchange of or reception of photographs like this were, if there was any, if these were personally just projects that they made for themselves, or if there was kind of an audience for photography like this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's another really problematic thing with these histories. Hannah Hönig, for example, her photo montages were shown in 1919 in the Dada exhibition, and not long after that. She was actually scheduled to have a show of collages in the Bauhaus in 1932, right before it was shut down, and the works were actually at the Bauhaus ready to go. So neither of these were seen for decades, and that's part of why, to be fair, they were also written out of histories. So Marina Bandt's negatives for these images were discovered in a shoebox after her friend Hayo Rosa passed away in Leipzig in the 80s, and he was the one always who developed her photographs. So that's how they first came to light. Many of them, the ones I was showing you. Gertrude Arndt also she happened to mention them to an interviewer in the 1970s, and people said, we'd like to see them. So they started to be known in individual examples around then, and increasingly more. And then there was an important exhibition of them at the Bauhaus Archive about 5 years ago. So that was important for drawing on this, but we talked to the family too for our exhibition, and covered as much kind of new material as we could about the circumstances of their making.
Thank you so much for this talk, Libby. I was wondering, is there in the archive any relationship between Arndt and Brandt, and is there any kind of correspondence between the two, or is Arndt so isolated that she's not really engaging?
I don't know of any connection between them. It's funny, I realized last night that the Google function on my photographs that I take in the archives is identifying, not just my cat and my family, but like Marianne Brandt throughout her life. So I started going through last night and being like, this is Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. So now my contacts are like all these dead people. But it's great because sometimes Google actually recognizes somebody in a photograph that I haven't quite seen. You know, they've totally changed their hair. I know I'm giving it all to the devil, but you know, just to figure out who 1,253 people are. I was at MoMA yesterday looking at the work of let me just think of her name, Hilda Hubach, who I wrote about her for Bauhaus Women, but she died, she didn't have children, and she gave a pile of photographs to MoMA, but they're not really cataloged. It's, you know, we were turning them over and like, oh, so Lionel Feininger took this one of her. Okay, I guess that's not a self-portrait. But to your question, they were working in very different workshops. Even though Marianne Brandt had this public role, she was quite shy. And Gertrude Arndt was moving much more in the circle of weavers. So I'm sure they knew who each other was, but the one place to actually look is when Marianne Brandt turned 75. A lot of people wrote to her. It's possible there's a letter there that I'm just not remembering. Thanks.
So I think in the interest of time, we should probably have our final speaker from this panel, and then we'll have a little bit of time to all talk together as well. Thank you so much.